Hey guys, it's Jennifer. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am coming to you with my October wrap up. So Victober went off the rails for me about halfway through. I just was really not in the mood to read classics in October, which was a real disappointment to me. And I know that most people who participate in Victober typically read, modern books in with their Victorian classics, but for the past couple of years, I've dedicated the month entirely to Victorian reading, and so I was very disappointed in myself. But of course, in the long run, it really does not matter that I couldn't keep to my TBR. It feels like for me this year, readathons have been a real struggle. I was very much burned out in Jane Austen July. I felt a little bit burned out creatively this month as well because I was constantly filming and trying to put up Victober themed videos, and so I think I've learned my lesson. And I think next year I will try to pre-film by quite a bit so that I don't have to have that stress on me. I can just read, and maybe that contributed to my overall mood. So I'm going to talk about the books that had nothing to do with Victober. So mostly I read fantasy. I was mostly pleased with basically everything I read this month, but mainly this first book, which, yeah, maybe it is. Maybe it kind of qualifies as fantasy. I'm not sure that it does. But that is Home After Dark by Riley Sager. So I was able to push through quite a few books that I have from Book of the Month this month, so I'm feeling good about that I'm making progress on that list. But Home After Dark is basically about a haunted house and about whether or not the house actually is haunted. And Riley Sager is a bit of a booktube darling, so I won't really get into this here, but this has kind of proven to me that maybe modern thrillers just aren't my thing. This is a genre I generally never set foot in, and I think there's probably a pretty good reason for that. I think I just know myself at this point, and I know that this is not for me. There were parts of this I just genuinely did not like, and I can't tell you what they are because it would absolutely spoil the book for you and spoil the main mystery element of the book and how the book is sold, how the book is marketed, so I can't tell you what about it specifically disappointed me. But I will say I was really not at all enamored with his writing style at all. So I can definitely see that he writes an extremely compelling mystery with a bunch of different facets, but I don't think that his prose is all that spectacular. I don't know if I will try another Riley Sager. I know a lot of people on BookTube love him. A lot of people in real life love him. My mom does, which is why I picked this up. I figured she would like it when it was one of the picks of the month, and she really did, and she told me to read it. And I read this on the heels of watching The Haunting of Bly Manor on Netflix along with everybody else and their brother this month, which I loved. And so I was hoping for more of that vibe. This kind of gave me that. It was a good spooky Halloween read, but I just wound up not really caring for it. I liked certain elements of it, and I did find it quite shocking. I just didn't much care for the execution of it, and I felt nothing for the characters. And I think that's mainly my issue with thrillers, is I think thrillers are about the mystery, they're about the action. They are very rarely about you getting invested in the characters. Then my next fantasy read that I picked up is easily my second favorite book of the year after Romantic Outlaws by Charlotte Gordon. That's The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by V.E. Schwab. I absolutely adored this, and I don't know how you have missed the hype around it, but if you have, the kind of tagline for this is that a girl falls in love with the devil over 300 years. And so the main crux of the story is that a girl makes a deal with a devil-like figure. He is not the Christian devil by any stretch, but she makes a deal with a devil-like figure to basically live freely, have freedom, and live forever. But when he agrees to do that, he curses her so that everyone she meets forgets about her. So she can't form any lasting relationships with people. But now, 300 years in, she meets a man who actually does remember her. And so that's really what the plot setup is. But the thing about it is, and I will say, there are going to be tons of people who do not like this because at the end of the day, what was the plot? I have already seen several reviews come out and say, I just didn't get what the plot of this book was. And I don't think there needed to be a plot. There didn't need to be anything. It just needed to be me following her for 300 years. I was just absolutely fascinated by this book about the relationships that she tried to form, which is an interesting thing to say because she really couldn't form a relationship. To her, maybe she'd been with a person for 3 months, but to that person, they'd had a one-night stand that night. They didn't remember anything about her previously in the past 3 months. And so it was interesting how she tried to leave her mark on them. She got them to think of certain ideas. And so much about Addie LaRue is about art. That's a lot of who she's attracted to. She's attracted to artists. So she gets put into paintings, or maybe she influences a musician to write a certain song. And so in a way, she is remembered. It's just not her name. It's just not her specifically. This book is absolutely brilliant. Truly, I was reading passages of this and I felt my chest tighten. And I mean tighten like, think you're in high school, you see your first crush and everything they do, you know, just gets that instant feeling out of you, and you get this warmth in your chest, you get this tightness in your chest, like your heart beat just a little bit faster. And that's how I felt reading this book. I actually had instances of that reading certain chapters. I said, it's like I am falling in love with this book. I understand this is a very hyped book, but for me, it absolutely deserves that on every single level. This book was absolutely incredible, and it left me in a lot of pain. I will say that it left me in a lot of pain, and I love for a book to do that. There's a lot about this that's just absolutely tragic. Kind of leaves you, you know, on the verge of tears. One of the most painful instances to me in here is really early on in her life in the 1700s. She's in Paris and she meets a guy, and they just have, you know, like a really fun, genuinely adventurous night together. And the guy falls asleep. When he wakes up, he has no memory whatsoever, of course, that they'd ever spent any time together. And he tries to pay her. And I was in so much pain. I felt her pain. Truly, this book is exquisite. It's beautifully written. I truly think this is the work of V.E. Schwab's that will be remembered. It is absolutely spectacular to me. But I will say, if you are a fan of Victoria Schwab, maybe from A Darker Shade of Magic, The Savage Song, something like that, this book might not appeal to you in the same way. And I followed her progress with writing this. I follow V.E. Schwab on Instagram and Twitter, and I listen to her on podcasts all the time. She has always talked about how personal this book is to her, this story is to her, and that she has always feared that it wouldn't be able to find the appropriate audience, that the audience she has built in as an author might not be the true audience for this book. I would say that's a little bit the truth, because I have struggled in the past with other Victoria Schwab books. I liked A Darker Shade of Magic. I hated the second one in that series. I never got on with this Savage Song. I didn't really get on with Vicious, but this book spoke to me on a very deep level. I absolutely loved this. I loved the discussion of history. I loved the discussion of art. But it's also one of those books, and sometimes you come across them, and as a reader, I'm sure you've had a book that, you know, made you thankful for the gift of reading, made you grateful to be a reader because you had the opportunity to read this story. That's the way this book felt to me. It is truly, truly spectacular. If you're skeptical about V.E. Schwab, I still say take a chance on this, because I don't find it to be all that similar to her other works, which I think will be a point of contention for maybe her regular readers, that they might not get on with this in the way that people who don't typically read her do. But I really genuinely adored this, and I highly, highly recommend it. So on the heels of that, I picked up Girl Serpentthorne by Melissa Bashardoust, which was also a really incredible read to me. So this is YA, this is a Persian-inspired fantasy. And it is about a girl who essentially has the ability to kill people with her touch. She kind of has poison in her skin. And she has always, you know, been locked away basically from the rest of her people because nobody wants her to interact with anybody and run the risk of killing someone. So this novel is really about her kind of finding herself, and it does it through the really interesting vehicle of a love triangle. And I love love triangles. I'm not somebody who's tired of them as a trope or thinks they're overdone, because I think love triangles can be a really great vehicle for character development, and that is absolutely what the case was here. So our main character is bisexual, which was really wonderful to see. So one side of the triangle is a monster girl, and the other side of the triangle is kind of what you think of as maybe a nice guy. And I won't say any more than that because all of these characters go through some major changes, and I think the vehicle of the love triangle, and it's not very overt. It's not like from the first, you know, this is a love triangle. It only really becomes that towards the latter half of the novel, but you can definitely see her struggle. It's an instance where both people in the love triangle with her were very viable options for very different reasons. So it didn't feel as though the two of them were, you know, just different romantic paths. It felt like they were different paths that she as a character could take. And so it just made the book really, really wonderful. This book is also a standalone, which I love. And I'm really obsessed with kind of Persian-inspired fantasies and desert set fantasies. That's always a really sweet spot for me as a setting. So this book hit a lot of marks for me, and I found the representation just so absolutely wonderful. I adored this book. And I didn't really care for Melissa Bashardoust's debut, Girls Made of Snow and Glass, which is kind of a retelling of Snow White or the Snow Queen, I think kind of mixed together, which should have hit a lot of marks for me, but didn't. So now I'm kind of curious if maybe I just wasn't in the right headspace for that. Maybe I should go back and reread that, because I absolutely adored this and I loved the way that she wrote the story. So this is another high recommend from me. Is this not the most beautiful cover of the year? I mean, wow, that's just stunning. I kind of want that framed. Next, I picked up Piranesi by Susanna Clarke because last week the Goodreads Choice Awards were announced, and I kind of decided on a whim that I would try to read everything nominated in the adult fantasy category. I don't think that that's going to go very well for me because I'm not going to be able to get many of the choices from my library. I decided to pick up the ones that I had, and so one that I had is Piranesi. This is incredibly short. This is an incredibly short fantasy book that is about kind of a magical house, and the main character believes this house is the world. And the interesting thing about this house is that it floods. The sea comes in, there are tides, there are waves, there are certain halls in the house that you absolutely should avoid because they're flooded. I thought when I started this, I said, this is way too weird for me. I mean, absolutely way too weird for me. But I said I'm gonna push on because in the past few weeks, multiple people have messaged me on Instagram and said, have I read this? Because I was going to love it. And so I said, well, there's a reason people are telling me that I'm gonna love it. So I've got to get past the first 50 or 75 page mark. And then things started to click into place for me. And this was absolutely fantastic as well. This was a great reading month for me in terms of fantasy. There is a mystery element to Piranesi that makes it a really engaging and thrilling read. There are actually aspects of this book that outright terrified me, and I don't want to say that and let you think that this book is horror or that it's going to be like full of jump scares or anything like that. It's not. I think it's a very personal phobia of mine, what the main character kind of goes through towards the latter half of the book. If you've read it, you maybe know what I'm referring to, and it was very scary to me. There were some very dark aspects to it that I didn't see coming. I guess I really didn't know what the book was going to be. I thought it was mainly going to be about the house, and the house is a large part of it, but who the main character is maybe the biggest part of it, and that's definitely why you should pick it up. I loved him. I absolutely loved Piranesi because he was so refreshing to read about. He had kind of like a childlike naivety and a real excitement about the house and the world that he lived in, and he wanted to take care of it. And I just found him a very refreshing main character to read about. So this is one I also highly recommend because I had a fantastic fantasy month. I can't comment on whether or not this is all that similar to Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell because I still have not finished that book, which I feel sure I will love that as well. That's absolutely probably going to get 5 stars from me. But I think her kind of quirky, cheeky writing style is also really present here. And so if you liked Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, you're probably set up to really like this too. And it is so short, so I kind of thought, I probably wouldn't like it because of that. I would feel like it didn't get into everything. It was actually the perfect length. The book did not need to be any longer at all, and it didn't need to be any shorter. This book was absolutely the perfect length for the story that it wanted to tell, and I also found that very refreshing. So last but not least on my fantasy list, I read Empress of Salt and Fortune by Nghi because of the Goodreads Choice Awards. I saw that was nominated, and this is one that has been on my list for a long time because I've heard a lot of buzz about it. So this is one of the novellas that is published by Tor. They have several novellas in their lineup that everybody adores. But sadly for me, this really did not work. I think I have come to the conclusion this month, I've read 2 novellas this month, and I didn't care for either of them because they were novellas. And so that's the case here, definitely. I was fascinated by the world. I was fascinated by the characters. I felt like I was just moving through it so fast that I really didn't have the time to process what was going on. And it's a very dense world in my opinion, so I think more room to breathe would have helped me envision it better, because I definitely wanted to see more of the world. And for you to be dropped in very much in the middle of things right at the start of the novella, I thought to myself, okay, we will get some clarification on things. We're really gonna see the world expand. And I think throughout the series of novellas, you will see the world expand. And so I'm curious to read the second one that comes out in December, because apparently it's telling an entirely different story. So the setup in particular for these novellas is that a monk is going around and recording stories for posterity. History is really, really important to them. And so they are trying to make sure that they get all of the detail right for some very mysterious stories that they only have small records of. And so this one is about the Empress of Salt and Fortune. And had this been a full-fledged novel, I just think I would have eaten it up. I think sadly I should just admit to myself that novellas don't work for me and I should steer clear of them, because I think it's to the detriment of the novella and it's also to the detriment of my reading experience. I think at this point I just understand that I don't really care for the novella format. But I see why this one made it onto the Goodreads Choice Awards, as I did with Piranesi. I hope Piranesi makes it very far. I'm not sure about this one because it is very short, but I imagine because it is so short, more people have read it, so I'm hoping that it gets into the top choice picks. I'm interested to see how the Goodreads Choice Awards go this year, because there are a couple at least on the adult fantasy side of things that haven't yet come out but are nominated and will probably win. And I don't really like that. I know a lot of people have their issues with the Goodreads Choice Awards, and that's a discussion for another day. But I'm interested to see how it goes. So next, let's finally get into my Victober reading. I'm still in the middle of one book, and that's Shirley. And I put this down unintentionally. This was a completely unintentional DNF because I was really, really enjoying this. I absolutely love her writing style in this. I love her characterization. And I feel so strongly about Shirley. I honestly believe that it will surpass Jane Eyre for me. And I hope that I'm not giving it too much early praise, but that's honestly my feeling at the point that I'm at right now. Although I did think I was reaching a point where I was going to be bored by it, which I think is why I put it down and never picked it back up. So I am only 175 pages in to Shirley. Hopefully I can get back to this by the end of the year. So a book that I kind of cheated on and I read and finished technically before Victober got started, but I'm counting it, is The Beetle by Richard Marsh. So this was absolutely fantastic. This was even better than I thought it was going to be. I thought this book was going to be about a mummy. It's not. It is about a person that can transform into a very large beetle, which is as weird as it sounds. But this book was just so much fun. It was funny. It was really interesting. I will say that to me, the depiction of Egyptian culture in this is absolutely egregious. And I know that a lot of people cut classics some slack where things like this are concerned. In this case, it is so blatant for me that it absolutely cannot be ignored. And I think it should be part of the discussion around the Beetle. But where it did that stuff wrong, I mean, way, way wrong, It did something incredibly interesting with gender here that I was truly excited to see. The Beetle, and the person who can turn into a beetle, is constantly discussed as being both male and female and having feminine and masculine traits depending on what light you see them in. And it also progresses from calling the beetle it in the narrative to calling the beetle them. So maybe not the best representation, let's call it like it is. It was not the best representation, but it was still really exciting for me to see something like that in a Victorian classic. I was truly blown away by it. I don't hear very much about the Beetle, so I was able to go into this rather blind, but I honestly don't know why we aren't discussing it more. It is so much fun. It's really adventurous. It's told from multiple points of view. To me, it very much felt like a Wilkie Collins novel, which I think is why I liked it. It felt like I was reading, especially the Moonstone. This was set up very similarly to the Moonstone. And so I just really, really enjoyed it. And it certainly had a lot of interesting social things to say. So this is probably my highest recommend of the month in terms of Victober reading. Next, I picked up No Name by Wilkie Collins, which I also absolutely adored. And so No Name is essentially about the question of illegitimacy in Victorian society. The main crux of this novel is that two sisters are proclaimed illegitimate and basically lose everything. They lose their inheritance, they lose where they were living. And so the main plot is one of the sisters deciding she's going to do whatever it takes to get that inheritance back. And so this book is obviously a sensation novel because we're dealing with Wilkie Collins here, but I think it also had some really interesting things to say socially about Victorian society and how people in Victorian society chose to interact with and look down on people from illegitimate backgrounds. So one of the big themes of this book is really, should the children be punished for the sins of the father? I really enjoyed this. I don't think it is as good as The Moonstone or The Woman in White. It definitely is not. There are some really weak elements to No Name, even though when you finish the book, you feel like, wow, everything fell into place and everything had its place. There is still 100 pages at the beginning of the book that set this up, and I hate that I kind of told you what the plot of the story is going to be, because you are not going to get to that until around page 100. But everything that happens in those first 100 pages happens for a reason, happens to set up something that does pay off later in the book. But when you're reading it, you're thinking, okay, get there. I know that something is going to happen and the plot is really going to take off, but when are we going to get there? Whereas I would tell you The Woman in White and The Moonstone are 5-star reads for me, and I don't think they can be improved on. The Woman in White in particular, I would say No Name is a 4-star. In my heart, I wanted to rate it 5 stars. In my heart, I really did. But I had to say to myself, is this The Woman in White? No, it's not. So I couldn't give it 5 stars. But I think this is a really interesting novel on many different levels, and it was playing with more social issues than I ever actually expected it to. So I just found this to be a really fun and engaging read. Then I picked up A Study in Scarlet by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and this was just okay. You know, I mean, this is what it is. It was a Sherlock Holmes story. It was absolutely exactly what I expected it to be, although it did have a fairly weird turn there in the middle that people had warned me about, so I kind of expected it, but it still felt like it was extremely odd given the rest of the book. This is the other novella I read that has basically proven to me I just don't like the format of a novella, and I just need to come to terms with it and stop trying to convince myself otherwise. I think I know at this point novellas just don't work for me. I also don't much like Sherlock Holmes as a figure. I've said that before as well. And so I think if you like Sherlock Holmes and you have never read the stories, you absolutely should, because you get exactly what you are expecting from this book. And you definitely get the characters in a way that you recognize. But Sherlock in particular does seem to be fairly different from most of the film and television adaptations that I've seen him in. He's a little bit funnier and a little bit nicer, maybe a little bit more caring than he is ever portrayed to be on TV and film, in my opinion. But I am going to try and continue on with the series because I feel like I will love Hounds of the Baskervilles, and that's what everyone has told me is push on, read that, read Sign of the Four. So hopefully I will enjoy those when I do get around to them. But this was just okay. I could take it or leave it. And I think it would have been a better reading experience all around had I gone into it with absolutely no expectations of what it was. It's very, very short. I just didn't feel like there was a lot of meat to it. I felt like it needed more page count. It needed more page count. It was 100 pages, maybe. I think it should have been 350 at least. That would have given the mystery time to breathe for me, and it also would have gotten me a little bit more invested in the characters. Next, I picked up Studies in the History of the Renaissance by Walter Pater, and this is a historical nonfiction text about the Italian Renaissance, and it's basically a series of essays on particular figures in the Renaissance and why they are important, what they contributed. But Walter Pater has a very particular thesis in mind, which is about aestheticism, things just being pretty for pretty's sake. And there's a lot here that was really, really interesting, I will say. And certainly some of the essays are more interesting than others. And so I just haven't rated this because I'm really not quite sure. There's a lot that is very, very interesting here. There is a lot that is also very, very weird. And so I'm not quite sure how to describe the book to you or who I think the audience for it would be. I can see that this was a very revolutionary text at the time that it was published. I would say it reaches greatness, but it is tempered by moments of absolute weirdness. There is a lot of really overt sexual connotation here that he goes into regarding certain artists and certain art pieces. He talks about, I think, in a pretty overt way, his own sexual experience and relates it to art. But there are parts of it that are just so beautiful and that just seem to really get it for me, that is really my vibe and really what I think I connect to when I think about the Italian Renaissance in particular. And it's all about how art should not only be of the moment, it should not only be about the present, it should have something to say about the future, and it should also be a reflection on the past. And so this book really made me analyze one of my least favorite pieces of Renaissance art, but is one of the most famous, which is the Mona Lisa. I don't get the Mona Lisa. I just don't get it. In fact, in general, I don't get Da Vinci's art. I get that Da Vinci was a genius and that he was a really remarkable human being because of his developments and other things, but his art, his painting, it does nothing for me. I just don't think he is an artist that I get on with. I don't think I understand him. But Walter Pater goes into this whole thing about why is the Mona Lisa fascinating? Why do people really look at the Mona Lisa and are stunned by her? Why is she the most famous, maybe, of Renaissance paintings? Why? And he says, you know, of course it is because why she's smiling. We always want to know, what is she looking at? Why is she smiling? He goes into this whole list of things that the Mona Lisa could be reflecting on, and really what the painting itself is saying is that, you know, the Mona Lisa is thinking about maybe these new developments in art, this resurrection of classical learning. She's reaching back into the past and thinking about Roman and ancient Greek poetry, but she's also thinking of current things like the Borgia papacy and the corruption of the Borgia family in general, and how, you know, Rome's about to be sacked in 1527, and you're like, yeah, you know what? It does seem like there is a secret to Mona Lisa, and maybe that is her secret, is that maybe she's somebody who sees not only into the future, but reflects on the past. He really goes in depth with that with the Mona Lisa, but he does it with several other art pieces and figures in art. And this was just a really hard book to rate because while there were moments of absolute greatness, there were also those moments of true strange and weirdness that I think have made the book fall into obscurity in certain circles. I see why the book became a classic in the realm of nonfiction. I also see why it is not a text that is studied to the greatest degree anymore in Renaissance studies, if that makes any sense. Last but not least, I read my favorite book of Victober, which was Armadale by Wilkie Collins. And no, this was not on my TBR, but I just got in the mood after reading No Name. I automatically wanted to pick up another Wilkie Collins book. I resisted it for as long as I could, and then finally I gave in and I read Armadale. So Armadale is essentially about two men who have the same name. They are both named Alan Armadale, and there is a woman who has a connection to them and understands why they have the same name, knows why they are connected. And so she is essentially the villain of the story. And this is also, of course, a sensation novel, and it really, truly is. This is something happening in every chapter, something blowing your mind wide open throughout the book, chapter after chapter, page after page. And I listened to this on audiobook while reading along with it for the most part, and I just found that to be a wonderful experience. It was a full cast audiobook on Audible, an Audible exclusive if I'm not mistaken, and it just made it such a wonderful read because there are so many letters in here and diary entries, and that just really adds to my enjoyment of a sensation novel. I think in truth it's probably why I enjoy sensation novels, is that I've noticed that's a bit of a theme, is this kind of mixed media format, including letters, including journals, and found pieces of notes, maybe telegrams. I just think it's really, really fun, and it adds to the drama of it. This was probably the most over the top of all of Wilkie Collins's books that I've read thus far. And it's also my second favorite of his books now. This is Beat Out the Moonstone. I rated this 5 stars. It's not The Woman in White for me in terms of characterization in particular. I just really like that The Woman in White, and No Name as well, had a very strong female protagonist, kind of centered. No Name is all about a female protagonist, but The Woman in White kind of puts a female character in a prominent position in the text. Here that also kind of happens, but it's with the villain. And I really enjoyed her as well, but I found the characterization of the men in this to be a little bit stronger. I just absolutely loved this. I love Wilkie Collins. I don't want to say too much about this because if you haven't read it, I think you should go into it pretty blind because it is an incredibly wild ride. And there is just always something else lurking around the corner that is about to be revealed to you. So I was really excited to find a new favorite. I found several new favorites this Victober to add to my favorite Victorian literature list, but this is the biggest success of the month for me in terms of Victorian literature. I found many favorites of the year this month. Armadale is my new favorite Victorian novel. Addie LaRue is my new favorite fantasy. I think October was an extremely successful reading month for me. So I would love to know your thoughts on any of these if you've read them down below. And I would also love to know what you read for October or Victober this year. But that's going to be all for me today. I hope you're all having a great week. Happy reading. Goodbye.